Great, thank you. Yeah, so if for those of you who saw the flyer or the announcement, Sean Wright, Dr. Sean Wright was going to give this talk. He wasn't able to make it today. I'm subbing in, but hopefully, he and I have collaborated on this PowerPoint, so you know, the information should still be the same. So don't worry about that. So really and truly, when we're thinking about weed management, we're thinking about the competition with crops for nutrients, water, and sunlight, which can affect yield and crop development. Weeds can also attract pests, especially, the first thing that pops to mind for me is aphids. So if you have a lot of weeds around, those can be alternate hosts for aphids, and they can really draw them in. Weeds can be hosts for plant parasitic nematodes such as root knot, which is here on the right, and they can also complicate crop harvesting. So if there's a bunch of weeds surrounding your plants, right, your fruit may be dirtier than necessary. It may be harder to get in there and get things out, harvest your tomatoes, harvest your lettuce, right? And so they can just kind of slow you down and be an impediment. So we've broken this up into categories, right? So your weed management options are really prevention, um, chemical, mechanical, and cultural. So prevention, right? Really, we're thinking about preventing weeds from developing and perpetuating. So here's a photo on the right. These weeds are really common in high tunnels, especially in cool weather. These weeds become an issue. So the tunnel stays warm enough compared to the outside, and you can really have quite a bit of weeds in cool temperatures. The sources of potential weed seeds could include, manure, compost, or other soil that you bring in. It could just be in your native soil where you put your high tunnel, of course, but bringing in something, quote unquote, from outside, foreign material that wasn't from your farm could contribute, or from, the inside of your high tunnel could create an additional contribution of weed seeds. So if compost is not correctly heated all the way, right, there could be viable weed seeds in there. A lot of people will, bring in additional soil. There could be weed seeds in there, right? So just keep that in mind. The idea would be the easiest thing is to manage weeds before they become large and produce seeds, right? One weed could produce hundreds to thousands of seeds if you allow it to get that big, get that far along. So prevention is really a continuous process that needs to happen all year long. And so for something like this, right, there's a few ideas. So a physical barrier for weeds. And you can see, even with this physical barrier, right, there's still weeds. So this photo was taken in March, like late March, and there's still like nice lush green weeds along the side, even with this barrier. So the barrier certainly helps, but you've still got to manage things a little bit on your own, just pulling, right? So physically blocking the weeds from growing. We use a woven weed mat like this. It's reusable for multiple years. We pull it up, we put more down, right? So obviously the weed mat that is needed for something like this tomato crop is not the same that's going to be needed for this lettuce crop, right? So depending on where we are in the season, we may pull this up and put a different one down, and we keep it from year to year. We clean it, we put it away, we label it so we know where it came from and what crop it's for, and we can easily find it again. And as I said, some weeds can still grow through this weed mat or up along the side, right? So just beware of that. It's not a foolproof barrier. And here you can see this again, right? So this grower is using like a thick polyethylene cover. It's not like a woven weed mat. And there's lots of grass growing up through the side, right? And this tunnel was kind of left unmanaged for several years. And even with this weed mat, you can see all this material grew up through the weed mat. Anywhere where there was even the slightest opening, the weeds came through. And sometimes they can even come through the material, right? So chemical is another option, right? And what I mean by that, obviously, is herbicides. So the Kentucky Department of Agriculture considers a high tunnel a greenhouse from the perspective of pesticide applications. So even if the sides and the ends are open, the high tunnel is a greenhouse, and you should read your product labels accordingly. So check the product labels for restrictions on the use of a product in greenhouse, right? So read the label all the way through, and look for that word, right? Identification of weeds you are targeting is usually necessary when you're using an herbicide in order for it to be effective, the most effective product. Some products are labeled for use on certain weeds, but maybe they're not the most effective thing. And so that would be something that you could contact your county agent, refer to the commercial vegetable growers handbook, or contact Sean or myself, and we can provide some guidance on that. But something to know for high tunnels, there is no product that is currently allowed to be applied in high tunnels while food crops are actively growing. So just right off the bat, I'll just make it easy on everybody, right? So when can you apply herbicides for high tunnel production? You could apply them prior to erecting the high tunnel, right? So if you're putting it on new ground, right, you'd certainly want to check the replant interval on the product label to make sure that it wasn't a year or two before you could plant something in the ground, right? You could apply herbicides to manage the vegetation around the perimeter, the outside of the high tunnel. However, you want to either use a wick wiper or a shielded sprayer. Be cautious of the direction of the wind, or if wind is blowing at all, as herbicides can be blown into the high tunnel and then affect your crop, right? You've had an unintentional application of herbicide to your crop, and I've seen this happen many times. After removing the plastic of the high tunnel, let's say you're at that, if you attended our webinar last week, you heard me talk about plastic replacement. Maybe you're at that 5 or 6 year mark, and your plastic's looking pretty shaggy. If it's time to replace the plastic covering, you could apply it then, because it would no longer really be covered structure, right? So weeds must be actively growing for herbicides to be effective. Keep that in mind, and check the replant interval again on the product label. So here's an example of a wick wiper, right? So you would basically make contact with the weed, right? The product would be on this end, and you would physically touch the weed with this roller. Mechanical, that's another option. And this is probably going to be one of, aside from the prevention, mechanical may be one of the most common, I'm guessing for most of you, will be one of the most common ways to manage weeds. So the physical removal of weeds. So that would include hand pulling, hoeing, cultivation, mowing, or weed eating, or flaming. So here's, those classic hand tools, right? This tool is really nice for small weeds in kind of hard to reach places. Maybe you're already, you're down close to the crop and you want to be careful, right? Of course, the stirrup hoe, that's one of my all-time favorites. The wheel hoe, if stuff's like kind of in the alleys, away from crops, this is a nice, easier way to kind of pull weeds up. Again, all of these things are going to be much easier when you have small weeds. If you're dealing with giant weeds, you pulling or digging may be one of the only ways to get the weeds up. And then, of course, here's a variety of other tools that may help. I have had to resort to a shovel more than once because the root was so deep that there was no other way to get it all out. Here's a tilther, and this thing's pretty cool. It's a little tiller, right? And it's run by a drill. So you do a battery powered drill here, and there's a cable that you pull on the trigger of the drill, and it makes it move. It can really move. It will burn up your battery on your drill eventually, so just be aware of that. But it's very handy for just light tilling of the soil. The rototilling can manage larger weeds, but can also bring weed seeds up from lower soil depths. So just be aware of that, right? You may want to consider allowing weeds to come up again and then cultivating again, right? So just keep that in mind. It may not be a one and done kind of strategy. Repeated soil disturbance can affect soil aggregates and water infiltration, right? The physical health of the soil. So, I'd say use this sparingly. This shouldn't be this may be a once a year kind of thing for a lot of high tunnel growers. Mowing and weed eating. So we use the mower primarily to manage cover crop near, like in this sense, and we've used it in the high tunnel too. It won't usually kill weeds, but it knocks them back and maybe buys you some time, right? But we certainly weed eat around the perimeter, and that is our preferred choice for managing weeds around the perimeter of our high tunnel. We put woven weed mat around the outside, and then we also follow with weed eating. Flaming, this is a great tool. It works best though, again, on small weeds. Larger weeds may be injured but not killed, so you kind of burn them back and then they pop back up. It won't work as well on woody weeds. And it can be kind of time consuming, honestly, and depending on the price of propane, it could be expensive. So just, again, be aware of the wind. Certainly you want to angle it so it's not pointed towards something that's going to catch fire, or I've seen people damage a crop getting too close with this kind of tool, right? Your pant legs, just be careful. But there are several options, right? This wheel on wheels, right? So this particular tool has multiple flames coming out of this bottom part, and so you would just roll it, right? Same thing here. This is just one torch, and you kind of have to carry, or you could put the propane tank like in a backpack sort of situation. So there's multiple options, but generally speaking, the smaller the weeds, the better this is going to work, and the faster it's going to go. So cultural, cover cropping, soil solarization, occultation, those are the things that come to mind when I'm thinking cultural. So, and we'll jump in with cover crops first. Cover crops are planted for the benefit of the soil or the environment, not for harvest, right? And so you can have a living ground cover. You shouldn't confuse them with a forage crop, although a lot of forage crops are also cover crops. We can use them as cover crops, but the management is different, and typically there's fewer inputs, right? So the benefits of cover crop extend well beyond weed management, but in particular, they can suppress weeds. They could potentially reduce the need for herbicides or replace herbicides entirely, reduce the need for tillage or soil disturbance, and they improve the soil structure, right? So if perhaps you've done a little bit too much tillage, getting some cover crop in there can help loosen compaction and reduce compaction and loosen topsoil, right? And a lot of people really like cover crops for the addition of the organic matter, right? They can also suppress pests and pathogens, but they can also attract certain pests and pathogens, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So qualities to look for regarding weed management, right, would be it germinates quickly, it closes canopy quickly, right? So you want your cover crop to compete well with your weeds, your potential weeds, right? So you'd want to start with a clean slate, right? Start with the soil that at least looks moderately weed free. Seed your cover crop, and you'd want that cover crop to germinate and close canopy before your weeds can beat them to it. You'd also usually want to produce a lot of biomass. That kind of goes hand in hand with closing canopy quickly and shading out the potential weeds. Some cover crops will have allelopathic effects, meaning that they can be detrimental to other plants, right? They either release a chemical, right? And so in the case of competing with weeds, that's a good thing. You also want to make sure that a cover crop isn't making some other issue worse, right? So it's not a host for pest pathogens or plant parasitic nematodes that are already a problem on your farm. And you will need to irrigate to grow a cover crop in a high tunnel. You will need to at least get it started. This photo, for example, you can see there's sprinklers set up in here, and that's how we got this going. So soil solarization. So my lab has done multiple soil solarization projects. They weren't targeted towards managing weeds, but we did see that as that was kind of an observation and an added bonus of the project. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of data, some photos on what we saw. So soil solarization increases the soil temperature by covering the soil with different transparent plastic sheets to retain radiant energy from the sun, right? So basically you're just heating up the soil. Ideal soil conditions for solarization would be pretty high soil moisture, no clumps or clods, and few to no weeds starting out. So kind of similar to what you would want for a cover crop, right? Nice soil moisture, not a lot of clumps or clods, pretty smooth soil, and not a lot of weeds visible on the surface at least. The target temperature for weeds is higher than what we normally are trying to target with certain plant pathogens that we have used soil solarization for. So it's kind of high, 110 to 125 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really going to depend on the weed species you are targeting. So knowing what weeds you're really struggling with are going to help you know what to do. And so this is just an example. This was part of a project we did last year. We did soil solarization beginning April 1st and terminated May 15th. So we did 2 weeks of soil solarization. So it would be April 1st to April 15th, 4 weeks, the entire month of April, and then 6 weeks of soil solarization that ended in mid-May, right? And so we collected soil temperatures at 3, 6, and 9 inches. We buried data loggers that collected sensors that could collect those temperatures. So at 3 inches, right, at the 2-week mark, it's still a little cool for if we had been targeting weeds, that would have been too cool. But at 4 weeks, we did manage to get that over 110 mark. And at 6 weeks, right, we're into mid-May, we did manage. However, at the 9-inch depth, not really. We didn't get there, right? And so this is non-solarized. You can kind of look at the non-solarized temperatures. This was a closed high tunnel with this clear plastic over it. And so here's another project. And so this is April solarization. So this is kind of just giving you all an example of what this looked like. So this was our non-solarized control 6 weeks after we started, right? Lots of weeds, plenty of weeds. 2-week solarization, 2 weeks. This is 4 weeks after the tarp was removed. So kind of looking at the longevity of this, right? The 4-week solarized treatment, this is 2 weeks after the tarp was removed. So that still looks pretty good. And this is the 6-week treatment. And this is the day the tarp was removed, right? So that looks pretty promising, honestly. So here's the July solarization. And this one was really impressive. So this is 2-week solarization, the day of tarp removal right here. This is it. Here's the non-solarized. You can tell there's lots of stuff growing. This is the 4-week solarization plot, 1 week after the plot was removed, or the tarp was removed. So that looks pretty weed-free. 6 weeks, here it is, weed-free. So of course the edges, we had a replicated study. So the edges where the tarp wasn't covering, right, definitely had weeds growing. But inside this plot, you can, and this was the 4-week, right? It still looks good. It still looks very weed-free. And so just to show this is not a chart that's intended to overwhelm you. So I'm going to focus you in on some temperatures, right? So the 2-week solarization, we definitely got well over the temperatures you would need to target weed seeds at 2 inches. at 4 inches, even at 6 inches, we were well within a range to target weeds. Um, in September, and I'll show you this, there was really only the 2 inch depth where we managed to get over that threshold. A little bit here in the 4 inch, but nothing in the 6 inch. And in April, the previous photos I showed you, 6 weeks, 2 and 4 inches. So weeds can be buried pretty deep. And again, every time you disturb the soil, you're bringing them back up. And so this is September. September was really not promising. 2 week solarization, 4 week solarization, 6 week solarization. We just really, as far as weeds go, it was not great. It was actually a really good, it seemed like a really excellent way to grow grass, if I'm being honest. So keep that in mind. Timing matters with soil solarization. It can be super effective, but the timing really does matter. The temperatures you reach, it does matter. Every once in a while I get asked about occultation. So occultation is similar to soil solarization, but the soil temperatures are typically lower and can be, and I look at occultation as something that could be potentially implemented year round, whereas soil solarization you would want to implement during the hottest time of the year, probably only during the really hot months. It's usually not as effective for long-term weed control. It's maybe more of a suppression strategy, but it uses opaque, usually black, impermeable tarps to block light and prevent photosynthesis. So preventing photosynthesis prevents plant growth. That's the thought there, right? So that's the goal. These tarps also hold soil moisture. But with both soil solarization and occultation, the less soil disturbance after treatment, the better the weed management, right? So that same idea of you wouldn't want to then come in with a tiller, right? And what I've seen some growers do with this is that they will remove the tarp, and there may be little weeds, puny, very sickly looking weeds come up. And then those can be really easily managed after that, right? They're very tiny and you can get on top of them, and then you have a clean slate. So high tunnel temperatures, even in the winter, those are going to affect, influencing the weeds, and then the irrigation practices. So, and for those of you who attended the webinar last week, I did talk about drip irrigation, but and I'm just going to circle back to that. This is also a weed management strategy, right? It directs the water to plant roots where you want it to be, right? Overhead irrigation is not only inefficient, and uses more water. It will irrigate the entire soil surface, including wherever there are weeds, right? So something to keep in mind, right? That's another reason to utilize drip irrigation. So for me, the takeaway message would be that, weed management is really an ongoing process. You've got to do it all year, a little bit. If you do it a little bit frequently, it makes it easier. But ultimately, you can't have 100% weed free. And that needs to be, the weed management needs to be balanced with your other necessary activities, right? Just crop maintenance, crop production, disease management, pest management, harvesting, right? Prevention is best, but sometimes things get away from us, right? And so the more you can do up front when you have time, the better. Managing them while they're small will almost always be the easiest strategy. And managing weeds outside the high tunnel is so important. So the weeds on the perimeter of your high tunnel can really influence the ventilation that your high tunnel is able to have, the pest population that may be coming in. So there's been a lot of instances where I've had to, jungle, right? It's like a jungle. I'm having to kind of bushwhack my way through the entrance of a high tunnel, because that, I think people view that as not as important, and it really is. And just keep in mind, don't be too hard on yourself. 100% eradication is really not a reality. Um, so, so just do what you can. Here's some resources for you all to take into consideration. So Delia mentioned our YouTube channel. This has several videos. This is where the today's recording will be, and last week's recording it already is, but it also has cover crop videos and the like, so feel free to take advantage of that. Our veg crops website has a lot of resources. Weed management, there's a whole listing on the Center for Crop Diversification's website on weed management and irrigation. If you want to learn more about tarping, they've done tarping would kind of include soil solarization and occultation. So there's some websites for that. This book is a really great book for people just getting into cover crops. And this little field guide is also really handy, and it fits in your back pocket. And I really like it. It has pretty much all the information. You could just really basic, straightforward, quick information on a lot of different cover crops.